The Vanderbilt family's position in this story is both privileged and complicated. They inherited wealth generated by railroad monopolies and robber baron capitalism. George spent that money building a monument to his own refined taste, employing servants and craftsmen at wages that seem exploitative by modern standards. The current Cecil family benefits from this legacy while operating a business that depends on Americans' fascination with the very inequality that created Biltmore. Yet, the Cecils have also demonstrated remarkable stewardship. They could have sold the estate decades ago and lived comfortably on the proceeds. Instead, they chose the harder path of preservation through entrepreneurship. They risked capital on ventures that could have failed. They accepted public scrutiny and criticism. They committed to maintaining something beautiful, not because they had to, but because they believed it mattered. George Vanderbilt died in 1914 at age 51. Having lived at Biltmore for less than 20 years, he never saw his daughter Mary, never met his grandsons, never knew his creation would survive into the 21st century. He built for himself and perhaps for posterity, but he could not have imagined what posterity would require. If he could return today and walk through the estate, what would he recognize? The limestone walls, the carved oak ceilings, the tapestries and paintings he selected, the gardens Olmsted designed, now matured and maintained with care. George would appreciate the mountain views that drew him here in the first place, but he would also encounter crowds where he expected solitude. He would see strangers sleeping in bedrooms he considered private. He would find his wife's sitting room roped off like a museum exhibit. He would discover that his forestry program has become an educational attraction. He would learn that people pay $30,000 to marry in his gardens. Would this horrify him or reassure him? The question cannot be answered. George Vanderbilt is not here to approve or condemn what his descendants have built from his dream. The estate endures without his blessing or permission, sustained by decisions he never made and adapted to purposes he never intended. Biltmore stands at the intersection of preservation and capitalism, proving that the two can coexist while raising questions about whether they should. It survives as monument, business, and family legacy simultaneously. It employs thousands, attracts millions, and generates hundreds of millions in revenue. It preserves irreplaceable architecture and art while functioning as an entertainment destination. 129 years after its completion, Biltmore remains America's largest private home. But it is no longer simply a home. It is a proof of concept, demonstrating that historic preservation can succeed through commercial operation. It is a case study in adaptive reuse without demolition. It is a billion-dollar business built on one man's beautiful obsession with creating something that would last. The mansion has lasted, but it has survived by becoming something George Vanderbilt never imagined and might not have wanted. Whether that transformation represents success or compromise depends on what you value more, the preservation of physical beauty or the preservation of original intent, the survival of the structure or the survival of its soul. Perhaps the only certainty is this: without the commercialization that critics decry, Biltmore would have been demolished decades ago. The mansion endures because William Cecil and his descendants built an empire around it. George created beauty. William created the machine that keeps that beauty alive. Stand in that entrance hall surrounded by tourists and try to imagine it silent, empty, belonging to one family again. The image will not come. Too much has changed. Too many people have walked these floors. Too much money has been invested and extracted. Too much history has accumulated. But look up at that limestone staircase carved from single blocks. Look at the craftsmanship that has survived 129 years. Look at the beauty George Vanderbilt insisted on creating regardless of cost or consequence. That beauty endures. The mansion stands. The dream survives. transformed but undefeated. A monument to one man's vision and 3 generations' determination to preserve it by any means necessary. Biltmore endures not as George built it, but because his descendants rebuilt it into something that could survive the world he never saw coming. George supervised obsessively. He reviewed every design choice, approved every material, inspected every room as it took shape. He traveled to Europe repeatedly to purchase furnishings. He bought 16th-century tapestries from French chateaux. He acquired paintings by Renoir, Whistler, and Sargent. He ordered custom furniture from the finest craftsmen. The house was becoming not just large, but exquisite, filled with objects of genuine artistic and historical value. The costs mounted relentlessly. Initial estimates had suggested the project might cost $3 million. By 1893, George had already spent more than that, with years of work remaining. The final cost would approach $6 million, equivalent to over $200 million in current value. George was spending his inheritance faster than the family fortune could regenerate it. He did not seem to care. On Christmas Eve, 1895, George Vanderbilt opened the doors of his completed mansion. He was 33 years old. He had spent 6 years and an almost incomprehensible sum building what remains the largest private home ever constructed in America. The house party that holiday included family members and close friends. They walked through rooms that took their breath away. They marveled at the scale, the craftsmanship, the sheer audacity of what George had created. But even as guests celebrated, a problem was becoming clear. The mansion was finished. The bills were not. George had built something magnificent and financially unsustainable. Annual operating costs would exceed $250,000. Property taxes alone represented a crushing burden. George's inheritance, though vast, was not infinite, and he had just spent most of it on a house. He had built a palace in the wilderness. Now he had to figure out how to pay for it. George Vanderbilt married Edith Stossant Dresser in Paris on June 1, 1898. She was 25 years old, descended from old New York aristocracy, but without significant wealth of her own. George was 35. The wedding was modest by Vanderbilt standards, attended by close family and friends. They honeymooned in Europe, then returned to Biltmore to begin their life together. Edith transformed the mansion from a bachelor's showplace into a home. She supervised the staff, managed the household accounts, and hosted gatherings that brought life to the vast rooms. She also became deeply involved in the surrounding community. The village of Biltmore, constructed on estate land to house workers and provide services, became one of her primary concerns. She established a school, a hospital, and a church. She organized social programs for workers' families. Where George had focused on the physical beauty of the estate, Edith focused on the people who made it function. Their daughter Cornelia was born on August 22, 1900. She was the only child George and Edith would have. Her arrival brought joy, but also highlighted the question that hung over everything. What would happen to this enormous estate? Who could possibly maintain it after George was gone? George continued to pour money into Biltmore. He expanded the forestry program, hiring Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, to manage the woodlands scientifically. He established a dairy operation with prize-winning cattle. He built greenhouses to supply flowers and produce year-round. He constructed additional buildings, including All Souls Church in Biltmore Village, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, in the same style as the mansion. The estate employed hundreds of people. Gardeners maintained the formal grounds. Foresters managed the timber operations. Farmhands worked the agricultural land. Inside the mansion, a permanent staff of more than 80 servants kept the household running. There were footmen and maids,
cooks and laundresses, butlers and housekeepers. Each required a salary, housing, and supervision. The annual operating costs were staggering. According to later estimates, maintaining Biltmore required approximately $250,000 per year in early 1900s currency. That figure included staff salaries, maintenance and repairs, utilities generated by the estate's own power plant, food for the household and workers, supplies for the farming and forestry operations, and property taxes on the massive acreage. George's income from his inheritance could cover these expenses, but barely. There was almost nothing left for savings or additional investment. Then the financial situation worsened. In 1907, a banking panic swept the nation. Stock values collapsed, credit dried up. Wealthy families who had lived on investment income watched their portfolios shrink. The Vanderbilt fortune, while enormous, was not immune. George's annual income dropped. The margin between what Biltmore cost and what George could afford became dangerously thin. He began quietly selling assets. Paintings left the collection. Some furnishings were auctioned. George tried to reduce staff numbers, but the mansion was too large to function with fewer people. Rooms that required daily cleaning could not be abandoned. Systems that required constant maintenance could not be ignored. The house itself demanded an army of workers. George also attempted to make the estate more self-supporting. The dairy operation sold milk and butter to local markets. The forestry program sold timber. The greenhouses sold flowers and plants. But these revenues were insignificant compared to the costs. Biltmore was never designed to generate profit. It was designed to embody an ideal, and ideals rarely pay for themselves. By 1910, George was in his late 40s and showing signs of declining health. He had never been robust. The same concerns about tuberculosis that had brought him to Asheville in the first place continued to haunt him. He tired easily. He spent increasing time resting rather than actively managing the estate. Edith assumed more responsibilities, working with estate managers to keep operations running smoothly. On March 6, 1914, George Vanderbilt died following complications from an appendectomy operation. He was 51 years old. He had lived at Biltmore for less than 20 years. The mansion he had spent 6 years building and a fortune maintaining would now pass entirely to Edith's management. The estate was valued at approximately $10 million, but that figure was misleading. Most of the value was locked in the land and the mansion itself. Converting either to cash would mean destroying what George had built. Edith was 41 years old, widowed with a 13-year-old daughter. She now owned 125,000 acres, the largest private home in America, and bills that exceeded $250,000 annually. She had no experience running a business of this scale. She had advisors, estate managers, and a board of trustees, but the final decisions were hers. And the first decision she faced was whether Biltmore could survive at all. The property taxes alone presented an impossible burden. North Carolina assessed the estate based on its total acreage and the value of the improvements. The annual tax bill ran into the tens of thousands of dollars. Edith's income from George's remaining investments could not cover both the taxes and the operating costs. Something had to change. In 1915, Edith made the first of several painful decisions. She began selling land. Not the core estate around the mansion, but the vast wilderness holdings that George and Olmsted had worked so hard to reforest. She approached the federal government with a proposal. The United States Forest Service, newly established and looking to preserve wilderness areas, was interested in acquiring large tracts for public forests. The negotiations took time. Federal bureaucracy moved slowly, but in 1916, Edith completed the sale of approximately 87,000 acres to the government for slightly over $5 per acre. The land became part of Pisgah National Forest, preserved in perpetuity as public wilderness. The sale generated roughly $435,000, enough to pay down debts and provide a financial cushion. George would have been heartbroken. He had spent years and enormous sums acquiring and reforesting that land. He had envisioned a model estate demonstrating scientific land management. Now, more than two-thirds of his vision was gone, sold to prevent the complete collapse of what remained.
But Edith had no choice. She could preserve the mansion and the immediate grounds, or she could lose everything trying to maintain the impossible scope of George's original dream. Even with the land sale, Biltmore's finances remained precarious. The reduced acreage lowered property taxes somewhat, but the mansion itself still required its army of servants, its constant repairs, its endless operating expenses. Edith cut costs where she could. Staff numbers dropped. Some rooms were closed off to reduce heating and cleaning costs. Entertaining became less frequent. The estate that had once hosted elaborate house parties for dozens of guests became quieter, more withdrawn. Cornelia grew up in this atmosphere of genteel decline. She learned early that her family's wealth, while still considerable, was not infinite. The mansion that had seemed eternal was actually fragile, dependent on careful management and constant vigilance. She watched her mother make difficult choices, balancing preservation against survival. In 1929, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression began. Edith watched the value of the family's remaining investments plummet. Income from stocks and bonds, never quite sufficient, fell to levels that could not possibly cover Biltmore's costs. She faced a terrible choice. She could sell the estate, likely to a developer who would demolish the mansion and subdivide the land. She could abandon it, walk away, and let creditors seize the property. Or she could attempt something desperate and unprecedented. She could open Biltmore to paying visitors. The idea of opening a private mansion to paying tourists was almost unthinkable in 1930. Wealthy families did not invite strangers into their homes for money. Museums displayed art and artifacts to the public. Historic sites preserved by governments or non-profit organizations offered tours. But a living residence, still occupied by the family that built it, charging admission at the door? That violated every principle of privacy and dignity that defined upper-class American life. Edith Vanderbilt had no alternative. In March of 1930, Biltmore House opened to the public for the first time. The admission price was set to $2 per person. Visitors could walk through the main floor rooms, marvel at the tapestries and paintings, and glimpse how America's wealthiest families had lived during the Gilded Age. The upper floors, where Edith still maintained private living quarters, remained closed. The response was immediate. Thousands came in the first months. The Great Depression had devastated personal finances across America, but $2 was affordable for middle-class families seeking a day's entertainment. They arrived in automobiles, driving the new highways that were opening the South to tourism. They walked through the banquet hall and stared at the ceiling 70 feet above. They examined the library's carved walnut shelves. They studied the paintings and tried to imagine the wealth required to live in such a place. For Edith, every visitor represented a small victory and a large compromise. The admission fees generated income that helped cover operating costs, but opening the house to strangers meant surrendering the privacy George had valued so deeply. It meant hiring guides to shepherd groups through the rooms. It meant roping off furniture to prevent damage. It meant watching thousands of feet wear down the floors that craftsmen had inlaid with such care. The early tours were modest. Guides, often estate employees, learning a new role, delivered basic information about the house's construction and its famous architect. Visitors were not encouraged to linger. The goal was to move people through efficiently, generating revenue while minimizing wear and disruption to the parts of the house Edith still inhabited. But the experiment worked. Through the worst years of the Depression, Biltmore's admission fees provided a financial foundation that kept the estate from collapse. When stocks paid almost nothing and bonds defaulted across the country, tourists kept coming.
They paid their $2, bought postcards in a small gift shop, and left with stories about the unbelievable mansion hidden in the North Carolina mountains. The success created its own problems. More visitors meant more wear on the furnishings. Carpets faded under constant foot traffic. Upholstery showed signs of strain. The heating and lighting systems designed for a private household struggled to accommodate the crowds. Edith found herself spending admission revenue on repairs that would not have been necessary if the house had remained private. She also faced criticism from her own social circle. Other Vanderbilt family members questioned whether opening the house to paying visitors was appropriate. Some suggested she should simply sell the estate and live on the proceeds. Friends from her New York society days expressed sympathy, but privately wondered if she had compromised her dignity. Edith ignored them. She had made her choice. By the mid-1930s, Biltmore had established a pattern that would persist for decades. The house remained Edith's residence, but it was also a tourist attraction. The two functions existed in uncomfortable tension. Edith lived in a subset of rooms on the upper floors. The public toured the ceremonial spaces below. Staff members navigated between their traditional duties serving the family and their new roles as guides and groundskeepers for visitors. Annual visitor numbers grew slowly but steadily. By 1935, approximately 20,000 people per year were paying to tour the mansion. The revenue, while significant to Biltmore's survival, was not transforming the estate's finances. Edith still worried constantly about money, but the immediate crisis had passed. The house would not be sold or abandoned. It would endure, at least for now. Then, in 1929, an unexpected opportunity arrived. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. was barely a year old when the United States entered World War II. Museum officials feared that enemy bombing might destroy their collections. They needed a secure location, far from coastal cities where priceless artworks could be stored safely. Biltmore, with its massive rooms and isolated mountain location, was ideal. Edith agreed to house the National Gallery's most valuable pieces. In early 1942, trucks arrived carrying crates that contained works from Rembrandt, Vermeer, and other masters. These paintings, worth millions even then, were carefully stored in rooms on Biltmore's first floor. Armed guards patrolled the halls. The estate became, for the duration of the war, one of the most heavily protected private properties in America. The arrangement brought no direct payment. Edith offered the space as a patriotic service, but the publicity was invaluable. Newspapers across the country reported that America's artistic treasures were being preserved at a private mansion in North Carolina. Biltmore's name reached millions who had never heard of George Vanderbilt or his chateau in the mountains. When the war ended and the paintings returned to Washington, Biltmore had gained a new reputation. It was not just a tourist curiosity. It was a place of national importance. Post-war America embraced automobile tourism with unprecedented enthusiasm.
The highway system expanded. Gasoline was plentiful and cheap. Middle-class families could afford vacations that previously generations had never imagined. They drove south to escape northern winters. They explored the Great Smoky Mountains, and many stopped at Biltmore. Visitor numbers climbed. By 1950, the estate was attracting approximately 50,000 tourists per year. The admission price had risen to $3. The tours had expanded to include more rooms and more detailed information about the Vanderbilts and their lifestyle. A small restaurant opened on the grounds, serving meals to visitors who wanted to spend the entire day. Edith watched these changes with mixed feelings. She was proud that Biltmore had survived when so many other Gilded Age estates had been demolished or abandoned. She appreciated that people valued what George had created, but she also mourned the loss of privacy and intimacy. The house she had shared with her husband had become a business, and businesses are never quite homes.
In 1958, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt died at age 84. She had outlived George by 44 years. She had preserved his creation through the Depression, a world war, and the dramatic social changes that had transformed American society. She had opened the doors to the public, compromising George's vision of privacy to ensure the mansion's survival. Whether he would have approved is unknowable, but without her decisions, Biltmore would almost certainly have been lost. Edith's will left the estate to her grandsons, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil and William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil. The brothers were the sons of Cornelia and John Cecil. They had grown up partly at Biltmore, watching their grandmother manage the delicate balance between preservation and tourism. Now the responsibility passed to them. George Cecil, the older brother, inherited the house and the core estate. William received other family assets. But in 1960, the brothers agreed to a different arrangement. William would take primary control of Biltmore, managing it as a business. George would pursue other interests. The decision would prove crucial. William Cecil was about to transform his grandmother's survival strategy into something far more ambitious. He was 30 years old, educated at Harvard, practical-minded in ways that neither George Vanderbilt nor Edith had been. William looked at Biltmore and saw enormous potential being wasted. The estate attracted tourists, but it offered them almost nothing beyond a house tour. They came, they looked, they left. What if they could be encouraged to stay longer? What if Biltmore could become not just an attraction, but a destination? The mansion had survived its first crisis. It was about to undergo a transformation that would turn survival into triumph. William Cecil understood something that Edith had not fully grasped. Biltmore was not competing with other historic houses. It was competing with theme parks, beach resorts, and ski lodges. Families planning vacations wanted destinations that could occupy multiple days. A 2-hour house tour, no matter how impressive, could not anchor a week's trip. If Biltmore wanted to grow beyond modest survival, it needed to become something more than a mansion. His first major decision was controversial. In 1979, he converted a section of the house itself into guest accommodations. 4 bedrooms on the second floor were renovated to receive paying overnight guests. The idea horrified traditionalists. These were rooms where George and Edith had slept, where Cornelia had grown up. Now strangers would sleep in those beds, bathe in those bathrooms, and wake to views across the estate that had once been purely private. The rooms opened at a rate of $150 per night, expensive for that era. They sold out immediately. Guests were willing to pay substantial premiums for the experience of sleeping inside the mansion. They wanted to imagine themselves as Vanderbilts, if only for a night. The revenue from 4 rooms was modest, but it proved William's theory. People would pay not just to see Biltmore, but to inhabit it. He commissioned market research. The surveys revealed that visitors stayed in Asheville an average of 2 nights, but spent only 3 hours at Biltmore. The estate captured a fraction of their total vacation spending. They paid admission, perhaps bought a souvenir, then drove away to spend money on meals and lodging elsewhere. William needed to capture more of that spending without compromising what made Biltmore special. The solution was to expand gradually. In 1983, Biltmore Estate opened its first full restaurant, Deer Park, located in a renovated estate building separate from the main house. The menu featured upscale Southern cuisine, expensive but not prohibitively so. The dining room offered views of the estate grounds. Visitors who had toured the mansion in the morning could return for lunch or dinner, extending their time on the property. Then came William's boldest gamble. In 1985, Biltmore Estate Winery opened for business. The decision seemed strange. North Carolina had almost no wine industry. The climate was wrong. Experts said the humidity would ruin the grapes. The soil composition did not favor viticulture. William ignored them all. He hired French winemakers, planted European varietals, and invested millions in temperature-controlled fermentation facilities and aging cellars. The winery occupied space in what had originally been the estate's dairy barns, built by George Vanderbilt in the 1990s. The massive brick structures, designed in the same architectural style as the mansion, provided an elegant setting. William preserved the exteriors while gutting and modernizing the interiors. Stainless steel tanks replaced milk storage. Oak barrels filled rooms that had once housed cattle. The first wines were unremarkable. Critics who bothered to review them at all offered faint praise at best. But William was not trying to compete with Napa Valley. He was creating an experience. Visitors could tour the mansion in the morning, have lunch at the restaurant, then spend the afternoon tasting wines in a beautiful stone building. They could purchase bottles to take home, extending their Biltmore experience beyond their visit. The winery succeeded beyond anyone's projections. By the early 1990s, it was the most visited winery in the United States, attracting over 250,000 visitors annually. The wine quality improved as the vines matured, and the winemakers learned to work with North Carolina's challenging climate. Some vintages began winning regional awards, but the real success was financial. The winery generated more than $20 million per year in revenue from tasting fees, retail sales, and distribution to restaurants and wine shops. William reinvested those profits into additional expansion. The estate's gardens, which had been maintained but not enhanced since Olmsted's time, received major restoration work. New plantings recreated the original vision. Walking paths were improved. Seasonal displays were introduced. The gardens became an attraction in their own right, justifying additional admission fees. He also developed new event programs. Biltmore began hosting weddings in the gardens and estate buildings. The fees were substantial, often exceeding $20,000 for a single event, but couples were willing to pay to marry in one of America's most photographed locations. The estate could accommodate multiple weddings per weekend during peak season without the events interfering with regular tourism. The Christmas season received special attention. William expanded the holiday decorations until they became an attraction separate from the house tour itself. Dozens of Christmas trees filled the mansion's rooms, each decorated to a theme. Poinsettias lined the staircases. Garlands draped every surface. Candlelight evening tours were introduced, limiting visitor numbers and charging premium prices for an intimate experience. The strategy worked. December attendance exploded. By the late 1990s, more than 30% of Biltmore's annual visitors arrived during the 6 weeks between Thanksgiving and New Year's Eve. The Christmas program generated so much revenue that it effectively subsidized the slower winter months. William also made a decision that would define Biltmore's future relationship with the surrounding community. He began selling land, not the core estate, but parcels on the periphery. These sales were carefully controlled. William retained approval rights over what could be built. The result was upscale residential development, estates, and luxury homes that complemented rather than conflicted with Biltmore's character. The land sales generated tens of millions of dollars that William poured back into estate improvements, but they also generated controversy. Critics accused him of betraying George Vanderbilt's vision. They argued that selling any land violated the principle of preservation. William responded that his great-grandfather had wanted to create beauty and sustain a working estate. The land sales funded both goals. Without that capital, Biltmore could not afford the constant restoration work that preservation required. By 2000, annual visitor numbers had reached 900,000. The estate employed over 1,000 people. Revenue exceeded $100 million per year from admission fees, lodging, food and beverage sales, winery operations, retail, and special events. Biltmore had evolved from a house museum barely surviving on admission fees into a diversified tourism business. But William was not finished. The most ambitious expansion was yet to come. In 2001, the Inn on Biltmore Estate opened. This was not 4 converted bedrooms in the mansion. This was a purpose-built luxury hotel with 213 rooms located on a hill overlooking the estate. The design echoed the mansion's architecture without copying it. Guests paid $350 or more per night for rooms with views across the mountains. The inn transformed Biltmore's business model completely. Now families could spend 3 or 4 days on the estate without ever leaving the property. They could tour the mansion, dine at multiple restaurants, taste wines, explore the gardens, hike the trails, and sleep in luxury accommodations. Every dollar they spent stayed with Biltmore. The estate had become what William always envisioned, a destination capable of competing with any resort in America. The inn also hosted conferences and corporate events, markets that house museums could never access. Companies paid to hold meetings in the hotel's conference facilities, adding another revenue stream. The property's appeal extended beyond tourists to include business travelers willing to pay premium rates for a unique setting. Critics continued to question whether Biltmore had strayed too far from its origins. The mansion George Vanderbilt built as a private sanctuary now anchored a commercial empire. Luxury hotels, wineries, restaurants, wedding venues, and subdivisions were grafts onto his original vision. Would he have approved? Would he have been horrified? William Seal had a ready answer. His great-grandfather had built Biltmore to last. The only way it could last was by adapting. Every other comparable Gilded Age estate had been demolished or converted to institutional use. The Breakers in Newport survived as a museum operated by a preservation society. Hearst Castle in California was donated to the state. Biltmore remained in family hands, still private property, still generating enough revenue to pay for its own maintenance without depending on public subsidies or charitable donations. The transformation William engineered between 1960 and 2010 represented a fundamental reimagining of what historic preservation could mean in America. Biltmore proved that private ownership and commercial success were not incompatible with preservation. The mansion endured not despite its tourism empire, but because of it. The numbers tell the story of what William Seal accomplished. In 1960, Biltmore attracted approximately 200,000 visitors per year and generated revenue barely sufficient to cover operating costs. By 2010, annual attendance had reached 1.2 million. Revenue exceeded $200 million. The estate employed more than 2,400 people, making it the largest private employer in western North Carolina. But numbers alone do not capture the transformation. Biltmore had become a template that other historic properties studied and attempted to replicate. The model was simple in concept, difficult in execution. Preserve the historic core with obsessive attention to authenticity. Surround it with complementary commercial activities that extend visitor engagement. Reinvest profits into maintenance and restoration. Remain privately owned and family controlled to maintain quality and vision. Other estates tried to follow this blueprint with mixed results. Most lacked Biltmore's combination of architectural grandeur, extensive acreage, and proximity to existing tourist infrastructure. Many discovered that building hotels and wineries required capital they did not possess. Some succeeded in expanding their operations. Others failed and were eventually sold or donated to preservation organizations. Biltmore's success also attracted academic attention. Business schools analyzed the estate's revenue diversification. Hospitality programs studied its guest services. Preservation specialists examined how commercial imperatives and historical authenticity could coexist. William Seal occasionally lectured at universities, explaining his philosophy.
The house had to justify its own existence through revenue. He argued no government would pay for it, no foundation had sufficient endowment. The only sustainable model was profitable operation. The winery continued to expand. By 2010, Biltmore Estate Winery was producing over 150,000 cases annually. The wines had improved dramatically from the early experimental vintages. Some bottles now commanded prices above $50. Distribution extended nationally, with the Biltmore brand appearing in upscale restaurants and wine shops across the country. Biltmore alone generated approximately $30 million in annual revenue. In 2010, Biltmore opened another major addition. Antler Hill Village was constructed on Biltmore land about a mile from the mansion. The complex included a farm where visitors could see agricultural operations similar to those George Vanderbilt had established. There was a blacksmith shop demonstrating traditional crafts. Multiple restaurants offered different dining experiences. The winery's tasting rooms relocated here, with expanded facilities for handling larger crowds. Antler Hill Village served a strategic purpose. It distributed visitors across a larger area, reducing congestion at the mansion itself. Families with children found more activities at the village than the formal house tour provided. The farm animals and hands-on exhibits kept young visitors engaged. Meanwhile, adults could spend hours tasting wines and shopping in the expanded retail spaces. The village extended average visit duration significantly. Where visitors in 1960 might spend 2 hours at Biltmore, those in 2010 averaged 6 to 8 hours. Some stayed multiple days if they lodged at the inn. Every additional hour represented additional spending opportunities. A family might pay admission, eat 2 meals, purchase wine, buy souvenirs, and return for a candlelight tour. Total spending per visitor group could easily exceed $300. William Seal also invested heavily in digital infrastructure. Biltmore established a sophisticated online presence earlier than most historic properties. The website allowed ticket purchases, hotel reservations, and event bookings. Email marketing kept previous visitors engaged, offering special promotions and announcing new programs. The estate built a customer database tracking visitor preferences and spending patterns, enabling targeted marketing. The Christmas program evolved into the estate's signature event. By 2010, Biltmore displayed more than 70 Christmas trees throughout the mansion. Each room received elaborate decorations following specific themes. Candlelight tours limited attendance to create an intimate atmosphere and charged premium prices. Some visitors returned annually, making the Christmas tour a family tradition. December attendance sometimes exceeded 150,000 visitors, generating over $40 million in monthly revenue. This seasonal concentration created operational challenges. The estate needed sufficient staff to handle December crowds, but could not afford to employ that many people year-round. The solution involved extensive hiring of temporary workers, college students on winter break, retirees seeking seasonal income, and hospitality workers from nearby resorts filled hundreds of positions for 6 to 8 weeks. Training this workforce and maintaining service quality required sophisticated human resources systems. William also faced increasing pressure regarding the estate's relationship with Asheville and the surrounding region. The estate's growth had transformed the local economy. Hotels and restaurants throughout the area depended on tourists visiting the estate. Real estate values had climbed as the region gained reputation as a desirable destination. But some residents complained about traffic congestion, rising housing costs, and the commercialization of what had been a quieter mountain community.
Edith was pragmatic. She had already sold 2/3 of George's mountains. She had cut staff, closed wings, simplified operations. Opening the doors to visitors was the next logical adaptation, and it offered something more than relief for the estate. Asheville needed work. If Biltmore drew tourists, those travelers would lodge in local hotels, eat in local restaurants, and shop on local streets. The estate itself would hire guides, ticket takers, and grounds crews. At a moment of near universal idleness, this could put people back to work. She decided Biltmore would open to the public in March of 1930. Preparations were substantial but frugal. Rooms were arranged for viewing. Ropes and barriers guided visitors and protected furnishings. Routes were mapped. Staff trained for crowd flow and questions. Tickets were printed. Notices ran in regional newspapers. Admission was set at $1 per person, high enough to matter, low enough to tempt visitors in hard times. The tour would cover the principal public rooms: entrance hall, banquet hall, library, winter garden, and selected bedrooms. Private family quarters would remain closed. Guests would enter at the front, follow a prescribed path, and exit at the side. The circuit was planned for approximately 2 hours. Opening day carried real uncertainty. Would anyone come? Would people in a depression part with $1 to see a house? Would Americans find the experience inspiring or voyeuristic? Attendance exceeded expectations. Visitors came from Asheville and outlying towns. Some arrived on foot, others by car, a few by wagon. They paid their $1 and stepped into the house George had raised and Edith had fought to keep. They entered the hall and looked up at stone climbing 3 stories. They stood in the banquet room beneath the triple fireplace and the ceiling that soared roughly 70 feet. They lingered in the library among thousands of books. They studied paintings, tapestries, furniture, and carved details. Some came for curiosity, some because they had worked on the estate or knew those who had. Some came for hope, to be reminded amid collapse that beauty and craft could still exist. The revenue was modest but meaningful. More important, the model worked. Biltmore had found a new purpose, not a private home, a museum. The 1930s passed slowly at Biltmore. Tourism brought revenue, not abundance. Visitor numbers rose and fell with the economy. In the worst Depression years, attendance was thin. As the late 30s improved, more people came. The estate stabilized without prospering. Edith balanced maintenance against ticket income, aware that a single bad season could trigger a crisis. Then came December of 1941, Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the Second World War. Tourism halted almost at once. Gasoline was rationed, rubber was scarce. Civilian automobile travel became difficult, then nearly impossible for leisure. Young men left for service. Families focused on getting by, not going away. The visitors who had carried Biltmore through the Depression vanished. Edith faced another financial cliff. This time, an unexpected option appeared. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. had a problem. Its collection, paintings, sculpture, and historic documents of immense cultural and monetary value, needed protection. With the nation at war and fears of bombing or sabotage in the capital, the gallery sought a secure site far from Washington to house its most important works. The requirements were exacting. The location needed to be inland, away from coastal threats. It required controllable climate, stable temperature and humidity for fragile art. It needed security, isolation, and restricted access. And it needed space, large rooms to hold hundreds of crated pieces. Biltmore met every condition. The house sat in the mountains, far from ports and primary targets. Rooms were vast with high ceilings. The structure was stone and largely fireproof. Mountain air was cool. George's heating system, installed half a century earlier, could regulate interior climate. The estate was private, gated, and reachable by limited roads that were easy to monitor. Negotiations proceeded quietly. In 1942, the first shipments arrived. Trucks rolled in at night bearing wooden crates stenciled only with numbers. Guards accompanied them. Crates entered through service doors and were carried to secure rooms, chiefly the first-floor music room and several large upstairs bedrooms with minimal windows, stable temperatures, and ample floor area for safe stacking.
The contents were extraordinary, though few at Biltmore knew specifics. The crates reportedly held works by Rembrandt, Raphael, Vermeer, and Gilbert Stuart, including Stuart's iconic portrait of George Washington, the image on the $1 bill. Paintings worth, in the aggregate, millions of dollars sat in darkened rooms while war burned overseas. Security was discreet. Armed guards patrolled, dressed in civilian clothes to avoid attention. Staff understood that something important was stored and were told not to discuss it. Edith herself rarely entered the storage rooms. Representatives from the gallery visited periodically to verify temperature and humidity and to inspect conditions. The arrangement continued through 1942, 1943, and into 1944. A house built for beauty and entertaining now served as a vault. The Winter Garden fountain still whispered, lights still glowed in the library, but the halls were quieter than they had been in decades. Few visitors, minimal activity, guards on rounds, and crates holding a portion of America's artistic inheritance. For Edith, the arrangement carried several benefits. The government paid rent, not a fortune, but reliable income while tourism had ceased. Federal guards effectively secured the entire estate at no cost to her. Most of all, the partnership affirmed Biltmore's significance. The house was not merely a relic of Gilded Age excess, it was a national resource trusted to protect culture in crisis. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. The war in the Pacific ended in August. As peace returned, the National Gallery began retrieval. Crates were loaded, trucks departed for Washington, and the rooms at Biltmore were emptied, cleaned, and restored to their former uses. The art survived the war unscathed. Biltmore proved its worth not only as home or attraction, but as guardian of beauty in darkness. The house had found another purpose, protector, and in that role, Edith recognized something essential. Biltmore could serve. If it could serve, it had value beyond George's original vision. If it had value, it deserved to endure. The question became how to secure that endurance permanently.
The food and beverage operations have become equally sophisticated. Biltmore operates 10 restaurants and cafes across the property, ranging from quick service locations to white tablecloth dining rooms. The dining room, located in a restored estate building, offers menus featuring ingredients from the estate's own gardens and farms. Entrees can exceed $50. Wine pairings add substantially more. The estate also operates a bakery, producing bread and pastries served across all food venues. A commissary kitchen prepares components used throughout the restaurants, ensuring consistency and efficiency. During peak season, the food operations serve over 10,000 meals daily. The logistics rival those of a small city. These operations generate approximately $60 million annually, making food and beverage Biltmore's second-largest revenue source after admissions. But they also require constant investment. Kitchens need equipment upgrades. Dining rooms require renovation. Health and safety standards demand vigilance. Staff must be trained to deliver service that justifies premium pricing. The estate maintains its own organic farm partially for these operations. Vegetables, herbs, and some fruits come from Biltmore-owned fields. Heritage breed chickens provide eggs. The farm is not large enough to supply everything the restaurants need, but it provides marketing value. Menus can claim farm-to-table authenticity, and the working farm serves as an educational attraction for visitors. Educational programming has become another revenue stream. Biltmore offers behind-the-scenes tours showing parts of the mansion not included in regular visits. The rooftop tour takes guests onto the steep slate roof with views across the estate. The architecture tour focuses on construction techniques and design details. These specialty tours command premium prices, often $50 or more above basic admission. The estate also hosts workshops and classes.
Wine education seminars teach tasting techniques and viticulture basics. Gardening workshops demonstrate Olmsted-inspired landscaping principles. Photography classes use the estate's photogenic grounds as outdoor classrooms. Each program generates additional revenue while enhancing visitor engagement. Some programs target specific demographics. Mother-daughter tea events attract multi-generational groups willing to pay premium prices for a refined experience. Gentlemen's bourbon tastings pair spirits with cigars in a men's-only setting. These targeted offerings allow differential pricing based on perceived value rather than cost. The estate has also developed corporate relationships beyond simple event hosting. Biltmore licenses its name and imagery to manufacturers producing everything from furniture to paint colors. A partnership with a major paint company created a Biltmore color collection, featuring historic hues found throughout the mansion. Customers buying paint at hardware stores can choose Vanderbilt Blue or Biltmore Ivory, connecting their home improvement projects to the estate's prestige. Furniture licensing agreements allow manufacturers to produce reproductions of pieces in the mansion's collection. A sofa similar to one in the library might retail for $8,000. Customers receive a certificate of authenticity linking their purchase to Biltmore. The estate receives royalties on every sale without manufacturing anything itself. These licensing deals generated approximately $10 million annually by 2020. They require minimal operational overhead, making them nearly pure profit. But they also extend the Biltmore brand into contexts George Vanderbilt never imagined. His private possessions become templates for mass production. The hotel operations represent the estate's largest capital investment and potentially its most controversial evolution. The inn on Biltmore Estate and the Village Hotel together contain over 400 rooms. During peak season, they operate at near full occupancy, generating room revenues that can exceed $40,000 per night across the entire portfolio. But hotels require constant reinvestment. Rooms need periodic renovation to meet changing guest expectations. Technology upgrades are ongoing as travelers demand better Wi-Fi and more connectivity. Competition from new luxury properties in the region forces Biltmore to maintain premium standards. The estate has invested tens of millions in hotel improvements over the past 2 decades. The hotels also create operational challenges that house museums never face. Labor relations become more complex. Unionization efforts have occurred periodically, though none have succeeded. Employee benefits must compete with those offered by corporate hotel chains. Turnover in housekeeping and food service positions requires constant recruitment and training. Guest complaints must be handled with hospitality industry expertise. A bad review on a travel website can damage bookings for months. The estate employs dedicated guest services staff monitoring online reputation and responding to complaints. This aspect of the business would be completely foreign to George Vanderbilt, who never concerned himself with strangers' opinions of his home. Environmental sustainability has become both a marketing tool and an operational necessity. Biltmore has invested in energy-efficient systems, water conservation measures, and waste reduction programs. Solar panels supplement grid power. Heat recovery systems capture waste energy. These investments reduce operating costs while enhancing the estate's appeal to environmentally conscious visitors. The sustainability programs also generate positive publicity. Awards from environmental organizations and green tourism certifications provide marketing material. Visitors who might question the excess of a 250-room mansion can be reassured that its current operation minimizes environmental impact. The contradiction between the estate's origins and Gilded Age extravagance and its present commitment to sustainability apparently troubles few guests. Biltmore's success has made it a model studied by other historic properties worldwide. Representatives from European chateaux, British estates, and Asian heritage sites visit to understand the business model. The estate occasionally hosts conferences for preservation professionals, sharing insights about revenue diversification and operational management. This influence extends Biltmore's impact beyond its own survival. Other properties have successfully implemented similar strategies, opening hotels, developing retail operations, and expanding food service. The template William Cecil created has helped preserve historic structures that might otherwise have been lost. In that sense, Biltmore's commercial evolution benefits preservation generally, not just the Vanderbilt estate. But each property that follows this path faces the same fundamental question. At what point does commercial success compromise the authenticity it claims to preserve? When does a historic house stop being a preserved monument and become merely a themed entertainment venue? Biltmore has navigated this tension for decades. The answer remains contested. The property tax situation reveals the complex relationship between Biltmore and local government. The estate sits in Buncombe County, North Carolina, subject to annual property tax assessments for decades. Those assessments have been contentious. The county argues that Biltmore should be taxed based on its value as a commercial tourism operation, which would generate millions in annual revenue. The estate contends it should be assessed primarily as agricultural and forest land, with the mansion treated as a historic structure rather than a commercial facility. The distinction matters enormously. Agricultural land in North Carolina receives preferential tax treatment to encourage farming. Forest land similarly benefits from reduced assessments. If Biltmore's 8,000 acres were taxed as commercial property at full market value, the annual bill could exceed $10 million. Under current assessments, treating much of the acreage as agricultural and forest land, the estate pays approximately $3 million annually. Biltmore has fought multiple reassessment attempts. The legal arguments are technical, involving questions about what constitutes agricultural use versus commercial recreation. The estate points to its working farm, its forestry program, and its land conservation efforts. The county points to the hotels, the winery, and the massive tourism revenue. Both sides have valid arguments. The resolution usually involves compromise assessments that neither side fully endorses.
Local residents watched these battles with mixed feelings. Higher taxes on Biltmore would benefit county services, schools, and infrastructure. But if taxes became prohibitive, the estate might reduce operations or even sell portions of the property. The economic disruption would devastate the region. Biltmore's presence supports thousands of jobs beyond its own employees. Hotels, restaurants, and retailers throughout Asheville depend on tourists drawn by the estate. The estate's charitable giving complicates the relationship further. Biltmore donates to local schools, supports arts organizations, and funds community programs. These contributions do not offset tax obligations legally, but they build goodwill. When the estate lobbies for favorable tax treatment, it can point to decades of community investment beyond what law requires. The workforce challenges reveal another aspect of operating a historic property as a modern business. Biltmore needs employees who can perform traditional roles like tour guides and gardeners, but it also needs hotel managers, sommelier, event coordinators, and digital marketing specialists. Finding people who can bridge these worlds is difficult in a regional labor market. Seasonal fluctuations complicate staffing. The estate might employ 1,800 people in February and 2,600 in December. Recruiting reliable workers willing to accept this variability requires competitive wages and benefits. Biltmore pays above minimum wage for most positions and offers health insurance, retirement plans, and educational assistance. These costs add substantially to operating expenses. Training staff to represent the estate appropriately takes time and resources. Tour guides must learn not just facts about the mansion, but how to tell stories that engage diverse audiences. Restaurant servers need to understand wine pairings and fine dining protocols. Hotel staff must deliver luxury service standards. Every employee becomes an ambassador for the Biltmore brand, requiring orientation that exceeds typical hospitality training. The estate has also invested in employee housing. Some staff live in renovated estate buildings, paying reduced rent in exchange for proximity to work. This arrangement helps recruit employees, but requires the estate to function as a landlord, managing maintenance and tenant relations. It is another example of how commercial operation creates obligations George Vanderbilt never faced. Cybersecurity and data management present modern challenges completely foreign to the estate's origins. Biltmore processes millions of credit card transactions annually. It maintains customer databases with personal information. It operates reservation systems for hotels and tours. All of this creates vulnerability to cyber attacks and data breaches. The estate employs information technology specialists managing servers, networks, and security protocols. They monitor for intrusion attempts and ensure compliance with payment card industry standards. A successful cyber attack could compromise customer data, damage the estate's reputation, and trigger regulatory penalties. These risks did not exist when Edith Vanderbilt opened the house to tourists in 1930. Social media has transformed how Biltmore markets itself. The estate maintains active presence on multiple platforms, posting images, announcing events, and engaging with followers. A stunning photograph of the mansion at sunset can generate thousands of shares, reaching potential visitors at no cost beyond staff time. But social media also amplifies complaints. A negative review can spread rapidly, requiring immediate response. The estate monitors its online reputation constantly. Staff respond to comments, address concerns, and attempt to convert critics into satisfied customers. This perpetual public relations effort would have been unimaginable in earlier eras. Now it is essential to maintaining visitor numbers and premium pricing. The pandemic tested Biltmore's business model severely. In March of 2020, the estate closed completely for the first time since 1930. No visitors, no hotel guests, no wine tastings. Revenue stopped while expenses continued. The mansion still required climate control and security. The gardens needed maintenance. Thousands of employees faced unemployment. The estate applied for federal assistance available to businesses affected by the pandemic. It implemented furloughs and layoffs where necessary, but the Seal family made a crucial decision. They would maintain the core preservation staff regardless of financial pressure. The mansion would be protected even if the business collapsed. Biltmore reopened in June of 2020 with reduced capacity and extensive safety protocols. Temperature checks at entrances, mandatory masks, one-way traffic patterns through the mansion, reduced tour group sizes. These measures reassured some visitors while deterring others. Annual attendance fell below 900,000, the lowest in decades. Revenue dropped approximately 40%, but the estate survived. The diversified business model that critics had questioned proved its value. When tour revenue declined, hotel bookings from regional visitors seeking staycations provided cushion. Wine sales through online channels offset lost tasting room traffic. The estate's financial reserves, built during profitable years, covered the shortfall. By 2021, operations had largely normalized. Attendance rebounded toward pre-pandemic levels. The experience demonstrated both Biltmore's resilience and its vulnerability. The business could withstand significant shocks, but total closure remained an existential threat. The pandemic highlighted that no amount of diversification eliminates risk entirely. The estate has also navigated changing visitor expectations. Modern tourists expect Wi-Fi throughout properties. They want mobile apps providing self-guided tour information. They share experiences on social media in real time. Biltmore has invested millions in digital infrastructure to meet these demands while preserving the mansion's historic character. Installing Wi-Fi in a structure with limestone walls 2 feet thick presented engineering challenges. Running cables through historic spaces without visible damage required custom solutions. The technology works mostly, but maintaining it requires ongoing investment. George Vanderbilt's electrical system of 1895 was revolutionary for its time. Today's digital infrastructure is equally essential, but far more complex. Accessibility improvements have required careful balance between historic preservation and legal compliance. The Americans with Disabilities Act mandates equal access to public accommodations, but adding elevators or ramps to a national historic landmark involves negotiations with preservation authorities. Biltmore has installed some accessibility features while arguing that others would unacceptably compromise historic integrity. The conversations continue. The climate crisis presents long-term challenges that the estate is beginning to address. More frequent severe weather threatens the mansion and grounds. Hurricanes that once rarely reached the mountains now arrive with damaging winds. Flooding risks have increased. The estate has enhanced drainage systems and reinforced vulnerable structures, but climate adaptation requires ongoing investment. The gardens face challenges from shifting temperature and precipitation patterns. Plants that thrived under historical climate conditions struggle as seasons change. The estate's horticulturists experiment with species that might adapt better to warmer, wetter conditions, but this contradicts the goal of preserving Olmsted's original vision. Here again, survival may require transformation. The question of succession looms over everything. Bill Seal Jr. leads the estate now, but future generations will inherit responsibility. The family has established trusts and corporate structures designed to prevent forced sale due to estate taxes, but sustaining family commitment across multiple generations is difficult. At some point, a Seal heir might decide that managing a tourism empire is not how they wish to spend their life. The estate has contingency plans for various scenarios. If family ownership becomes impossible, a conservation easement might protect the property from development while allowing new management. If that fails, donation to a preservation organization remains possible. But the family strongly prefers to maintain control, believing that private ownership enables better stewardship than institutional management would allow. This belief may be self-serving, but it has historical support. The estate has invested more in preservation and improvement than most nonprofit organizations could afford. The profit motive, properly managed, funds conservation that donations and admissions alone would not sustain. Biltmore's success suggests that capitalism and preservation can align, at least under specific circumstances.
Stand in the entrance hall of Biltmore today, and the contradictions become impossible to ignore. Above you rises a limestone staircase carved from single blocks, one of the most photographed architectural features in America. Around you stand hundreds of tourists clutching smartphones, many wearing shorts and sneakers, queuing for guided tours that depart every 15 minutes. You are inside George Vanderbilt's private home and inside a billion-dollar entertainment complex. Both things are simultaneously true. The current visitor experience reflects decades of refinement. Guests purchase timed entry tickets online, selecting specific tour times to prevent overcrowding. Upon arrival, they pass through a welcome center that feels more like an upscale shopping mall than a museum entrance. Restrooms, a cafe, and a large gift shop occupy the ground floor. Escalators carry visitors to the ticketing level. The entire facility was designed to process thousands of people daily while maintaining an atmosphere of unhurried elegance. The mansion tour itself lasts approximately 90 minutes for those who read every placard and examine every room carefully. Many visitors move faster, spending perhaps an hour inside. They walk through spaces where George and Edith lived, but those spaces now contain velvet ropes, alarm sensors, and discrete climate monitoring equipment. The rooms are preserved as they appeared during the Vanderbilt occupancy, but they function now as museum exhibits rather than living spaces. Guides recite carefully scripted information about the family, the architecture, and the objects on display. The scripts are researched thoroughly and updated regularly as historians discover new information, but they are still scripts designed to convey specific narratives in an allotted time. The spontaneity of actual family life has been replaced by professional presentation. Approximately 40% of current visitors are repeat guests. They return to see Christmas decorations, spring flowers in the gardens, or simply to experience the mansion again. Some have visited dozens of times over decades.
For these regulars, Biltmore functions less as a historic site than as a familiar retreat, a beautiful place to spend a few hours away from ordinary life. The estate's endurance can be measured in multiple ways. It has survived 129 years since completion, longer than George himself lived. It has outlasted more than 90% of comparable Gilded Age mansions, most demolished within decades of construction. It remains in family ownership when nearly every similar property has been sold, donated, or seized for unpaid taxes. Financially, the numbers tell a success story that would have seemed impossible in 1930, when Edith first opened the doors. Annual revenue of $300 million dwarfs the $2 admission fees she nervously charged. The estate's valuation, if it ever came to market, would likely exceed $1 billion. Property insurance alone costs millions annually, reflecting the irreplaceable nature of what is being protected. But financial success does not answer the fundamental question: is this what preservation means? George Vanderbilt wanted to create a private sanctuary, demonstrating that American wealth could produce lasting beauty. His estate now demonstrates that lasting beauty requires commercial exploitation. Which lesson would he consider more important? Preservation purists argue that Biltmore has compromised too much. They point to the hotels built on estate grounds, the weddings staged in the gardens, the retail operations selling trinkets. They contend that the mansion has become a prop for a tourism business rather than a protected monument. Some suggest the estate should have been donated to a non-profit organization decades ago, accepting lower revenue in exchange for educational mission purity. But the counter-argument is compelling. Non-profit historic sites struggle constantly with funding. They depend on admission fees that barely cover operating costs, supplemented by donations that fluctuate with economic conditions. They defer maintenance, close sections of properties, and reduce staff during budget crises. Biltmore has avoided all of this by generating profit sufficient to fund preservation at the highest standards. The mansion's condition supports this view. The conservation work Biltmore performs exceeds what most museums can afford. Textiles are rotated on regular schedules to minimize light exposure. Climate control maintains precise temperature and humidity levels year-round. Professional conservators treat paintings, furniture, and decorative objects on an ongoing basis. The roof receives maintenance that prevents small problems from becoming catastrophic failures. This level of care costs approximately $10 million annually, separate from general operating expenses. Few nonprofit organizations command budgets allowing such investment. Biltmore's commercial revenue makes it possible. The mansion is arguably better preserved now than at any point in its history, protected by systems and expertise that did not exist when George lived there. The estate has also preserved the surrounding landscape in ways that pure commercial development would never have allowed. The 8,000 acres remaining in family ownership function as a de facto greenbelt, preventing sprawl and protecting viewsheds. The forestry program George established continues operating, demonstrating sustainable timber management. These conservation achievements result directly from the family's ability to generate revenue from tourism rather than logging or real estate development. Biltmore's influence on American preservation extends beyond its own survival. The model has inspired other historic properties to expand commercial operations. Mount Vernon has added museums and educational facilities. Hearst Castle developed visitor services. European estates have studied Biltmore's approach to revenue diversification. The template has become standard for properties attempting to remain financially viable. Critics note that this template also normalizes commercialization. Each successful hotel added to a historic property makes the next one seem less controversial. Wedding venues become expected amenities rather than questionable intrusions. The line between preservation and entertainment blurs until distinguishing between them becomes difficult. The estate's relationship with academic historians reveals another tension. Biltmore employs professional historians who research the family and maintain archives. They publish findings and share information with scholars. But the estate also controls access to primary sources and shapes narratives presented to visitors.
Some academic researchers have complained about restrictions on archival access or pressure to frame findings in ways that support institutional messaging. This is not unique to Biltmore. All institutions that control historical resources exercise some degree of gatekeeping. But when the institution is also a profit-making business, questions arise about whether commercial interests influence historical interpretation. Does Biltmore present the most accurate history possible, or the most marketable version of that history? The tours themselves demonstrate this tension. Guides discuss George's vision and Edith's courage, but rarely mention family conflicts, business failures, or darker aspects of Gilded Age inequality. The narrative emphasizes beauty, innovation, and preservation success. Less comfortable topics receive minimal attention. This is commercially sound, but historically incomplete.